We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work.
We pay our respects to the elders past and present.
Throughout time, Brisbane, the land by the river,
has been a path of transport
for all people.
A place of connection.
a place of many tracks.
The ancestors and elders travelled this terrain long ago, following tracks
that we follow today.
We recognise their connection to this country,
The waterways and community.
As we build this path through country,
while we tunnel deep beneath our river, laying tracks for greater connection.
Creating new places for the future.
we acknowledge the rich traditions and the stories of the past.
At the many places we are working to bring this project to life.
Across Brisbane,
the Gold Coast and Greater Southeast Queensland.
With an open heart
In mind,
we hope to
learn from the traditions, stories, customs
and practices of Australia's First Nations people.
together
As we build this track
For the future.
All right, so good morning everyone, and thanks for joining the live stream, and welcome to the last of Cross River Rail's National Archaeology Week of the live stream series. My name's Tom Dooley. I'm an archaeologist with the Everick Foundation, and I've been invited here to talk to you a bit today about how technology is changing archaeology. Now, obviously, it's a pretty broad topic for a diverse discipline, so it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour today. I'll just try and give you a bit of a sample. And so it'll be a mix between, a few of the technologies that are really becoming, staples within the discipline that, in the last few years have really changed the way we work, through to the areas where I feel the most exciting innovations are coming up, and sort of the most exciting areas to be looking at going forward. But before we jump into that, a bit about me first, just for a bit of context. So my little corner of archaeology that I've worked in, I found has sort of split me between a few different but closely related worlds. So first off, of course, the kind of archaeology that we're all familiar with, excavating archaeological sites here and around the world to, investigate past societies. But also through to work that looks a little bit more like this. So, conducting cultural heritage surveys out on paddocks out in Western Queensland alongside teams of Aboriginal traditional owners to help them identify what kind of physical expressions of their heritage are out there in the landscape, and to draft management plans for how we might be able to protect that heritage for future generations. And right through to work very much like what I'm doing right now. So science communication and community outreach to sort of share the kind of discoveries that we're making every day, and just generally spread the good word of archaeology to all and sundry. But importantly, throughout this work, I have utilized a whole suite of technologies, and it's that experience that I'm going to be drawing on today. But to properly get a grasp of how technology is going to make changes within any discipline, there's a couple big questions that you've got to ask first. And as far as archaeology is concerned, if you've been following the live stream series, you'll be all over this. But the questions are, what are we interested in? What do we do day to day? And then what do we, physically speaking, what do we deal with? And so as archaeologists, we are interested in the study of the human past through its physical remains. So how do we do this? We do that by locating and analysing physical sites and objects out there in the landscape which have been left behind by people in the past, and which tells us a little bit about what their lives were like. And now, sometimes this is going to be, the next great discovery that's going to rewrite, human history as it tours the museums of the world. But far more often, what you'll find is that archaeology is a load of rubbish. So broken pots, little bits of bone, ruined structures. But what you'll find is that it's really most often just this rubbish that's going to tell the most complete story of what life was really like for most people in the past. And so what does that look like? Well, very often, it looks something just like this. And of course, this is where all the fun happens. You're in there, hands-on with the archaeology, getting your hands dirty, going down through time. And in a lot of ways, the nuts and bolts of this kind of work hasn't changed all that much. We're still excavating with trowels, we're still digging with shovels, we're still pushing wheelbarrows. But there's an awful lot of work that goes into getting to this point, and an awful lot of follow-up work that's got to be done on what you find. And it's those types of areas where technology is really going to do your heavy lifting. And these kind of technologies, I feel, can really be lumped into a few key themes. So before you can get in there in the fun and start digging, first, you've got to locate your archaeology, and then once you get started, you've got to record everything you're doing in meticulous detail to make sure that your analyses really can pull out as much information as possible. And then after the fact, all these discoveries that we're making and the things that we're learning really don't mean very much if we don't then take the next step of sharing it on and really contributing to our common understanding of what the past was like. And so in these three themes, that's really where technology is pushing the envelope for archaeology, and where I think some of the most exciting changes are happening. But yes, to launch us straight into our first theme, how do we locate our archaeology? And we'll begin with what is really, first port of call for a lot of archaeologists, and what is really, one of the great tools of our age, which is freely accessible satellite imagery. And so whether it's identifying archaeology from the air outright, as is the case with something like crop circles, or whether it is, you're able to get a bit of background just from the photo of, what kind of geology you're working with, what landforms are there that might give you a picture of where you'd expect to find archaeology. But, it has its limitations. And as a bit of a demonstration and as a bit of a cautionary tale, I bet you've all been wondering why I've been staring at this blurry and probably fairly bland photo of God knows where. Well, I can tell you that you've actually been staring squarely at a highly significant ritual ground up in far north Queensland. So if anybody spotted any traces of that, kudos to you. But for the rest of us, right there at the point of that arrow, you might just be able to see is actually a stone dance circle. And I can tell you that that is just one of actually a whole complex of stone arrangements actually within the frame of that image and elsewhere. So, important, but not necessarily very easy to spot from something like satellite imagery. So, this is where archaeologists are really going to move into something more like their own aerial photography. So traditionally, things like, helicopters and light aircraft, like my colleague is getting ready for there, but increasingly today, drones. So the real advantage of this is not only, can you take much higher resolution photos of your area of interest, but you can also define your own angle, so you can come slightly off that bird's eye view, and you can inspect these areas live. and especially with the drones, really get up close and personal. And now our next big aerial remote sensing, our next big technology, I won't go too much into because I know Dr. Kelsey Lowe spoke a bit about this earlier on in the week, but LiDAR definitely has made huge changes for how we find sites. So, a device mounted in some kind of aircraft that fires a laser down towards the ground and then measures the delay in reflection of that laser back to the device so that it can then map a height map of the ground, sort of the changes in elevation, down to quite surprising levels of fine detail. So as in the case of that image down in the bottom left of the screen there, which is an underwater Aboriginal fish trap located off the coast of Western Australia, made up of quite small stones. And this is just a couple of more examples of how LiDAR can really make a difference even when you're dealing with heavy vegetation or quite noisy landscapes. It can pull right out, archaeology like these structural systems there, or like earthworks and fortifications, that kind of thing. But another big technology that you might not have heard quite so much about in remote sensing, aerial remote sensing that is multispectral imagery. So if you can imagine a device aerially mounted again, or often satellite mounted, that captures data from well beyond the visible spectrum of light, and which then allows the researcher to slice that data up into different sections, different ranges of the spectrum, and then overlay them to achieve the highest possible contrast of the features that you're interested in and separate out all the noise. And so quite interestingly, there's a bit of a sub-discipline developing called space archaeology, which is sort of where archaeologists, just from the comfort of their own homes at their laptop, can get access to this data, cast their gaze over to the jungles of Mesoamerica and discover whole temple complexes that have never been seen before, or as in the case of these images here, cast their gaze again over to Egypt, and entire new settlements just emerge to them out of the sands, which doesn't sound like a bad gig, but at the same time, at least for me personally, it seems to lack a little bit of the adventure that most people are looking for in archaeology, but each their own. Yes, and so all these techniques that we've just spoken about, they all really rely on there being some kind of physical expression of archaeology at the surface level, which is great, but what about all your pesky archaeology that's buried deep below the ground and that you're never going to be able to see from the air, regardless of what technology you have? Well, that's where we move on to ground-based remote sensing, also known as geophysical prospection. And so a few of these techniques that I've got up there on the screen you might be familiar with already, you might have seen around. But what's interesting is that these are the major players, and all of them, how they work is they're each measuring anomalies in some kind of electromagnetic phenomena, right? So in the case of ground-penetrating radar, which I'm sure you're familiar with, fires a pulse of electromagnetic energy down through the ground, and then has a device that measures the delay and magnitude of the reflection of that pulse back up to the device, and that's really good for finding quite solid archaeology like building foundations or earthworks, that kind of thing. And then when we move on to something like resistivity, that device, it's got a couple of probes that you dig down into the ground again and again along your survey grid, and those probes have a current running between them. And what the device is measuring is how materials under the ground resist the conductivity of that current from one probe to the other. And what you can use that for is locating what we call voids, so empty spaces under the ground. So if you can imagine, caskets from burials or tombs, that kind of thing. And then if we move over to magnetometry, up there in the top right, so rather than inducing some kind of electromagnetic energy like most of these other techniques, this device actually directly measures Earth's magnetic field in search of local distortions from local anomalies. And so this device here is actually a gradiometer. It's got 2 sensors on each of those poles, and you walk them back and forth over your survey grid. And that device measures the difference in the readings between those 2 sensors to give you the gradient or the change in the local expression of Earth's magnetic field in search for distortions and anomalies. And quite a few things, surprisingly enough, actually can distort Earth's magnetic field. And so these kind of things are like metals often, so that's often what it's used for, but then also burning events, so hearths, that kind of thing. And then also the use of the 2 sensors also helps triangulate the location of these anomalies so that they can then be mapped in 2D space so that you can then know where to dig. And just to show you a little bit of what that data looks like, we've got data from a few techniques there. Over on the left, the GPR and resistivity data, they're both showing data in a cross-section down through the ground. And the GPR data, what you're looking at there is the red and the white is actually shell, bone, and stone artifact material distributed in ancient middens that have now been buried. And there's actually several layers of these middens going back down through time. And then in the resistivity data down the bottom, so what that's actually looking at, these red blobs, is that they are voids, open spaces underneath the ground. And that data is actually from a project trying to locate secret chambers outside the known extent of King Tutankhamun's tomb over in the Valley of Kings in Egypt. So a really fascinating project, that one. And then we've also got magnetometry data of a Roman commander's cottage, and then susceptibility data of a whole mess of pits and post holes, which are the absolute bane of any archaeologist working anywhere in Europe, let me tell you. And that's from first-hand experience. So that's so much for how we find these sites. But then once we found them, once we've started investigating them, there's a whole other suite of technology that can really help us and sort of push the envelope in what we do. But the real time savers, the things that are really going to allow us to get out there and do more of the good work that we do, all have to do with the true villains of archaeology, the 3Ds, which are, of course, data, data, and more data, lots of it. And any time that you can save yourself with data is going to pay huge dividends. But before you switch off, I promise there is something interesting to say about data, so bear with me. And I won't spend too much time on this, but you will have imagined coming in that the kinds of advancements in information technology and portable devices will have offered the same kind of opportunities for archaeology as it will have in your own workplaces and any kind of discipline. The ability to be out there in the field and capture and instantly digitize data and then sync it across your whole project live is huge. But then also you probably also will have imagined advancements in global positioning systems and geographic information systems will just allow us to do what we do much better. But especially nowadays, that we're getting down to sort of precision to the sub-centimetre level, we can really switch from just being able to map spatial relationships at the landscape scale right down to the site scale and even the feature scale. So if you can imagine, some of these world-class operations, excavations, where every single artifact or material of interest that's discovered at a site will have its precise location and orientation recorded by one of these devices, so that all that data for the whole project can then be brought together and you can actually reconstruct a site and all its finds in 3D space and then perform new analyses on that information, which is quite interesting. And something else that you might not have considered for archaeology is what happens when we really bring an awful lot of this data together. So this image here, every one of those little yellow dots is an archaeological site that has been previously recorded. And so if you imagine, from that we have data on the geographic coordinates of these sites. We have the location. We have what kind of sites they are, what was recorded there, what was found there. But then if we pull this data together with other information that we can about those locations, such as the local geology, the local biome, local vegetation, proximity to permanent water sources, proximity to other natural resources, and then add into that things like the study areas of previous projects and even the survey tracks of the devices that we carry around with us every day, we can then get information on where archaeologists have looked before and where they haven't. And then if we pull all this together, overlay this data, we can then run it through a process which pulls out all the relevant variables which correlate to the presence of archaeology in the landscape, which is exactly what we've done for this area of Queensland out near Miles. And the interesting thing is we can then carry that forward and use it to predict where new archaeology is likely to have occurred from sort of, a big data perspective. So in this map that we've got here, we've categorized the likelihood of encountering archaeology from low in the green right through to very high in the red. And of course, this can be used to inform archaeological researchers, to inform the design of their next projects where they're expecting to find archaeology. But it can also be used by traditional owner groups to help inform their own management of their own country and of their own heritage. And then it can also be useful for developers and governments to inform the design of their projects so that they can help minimize the kind of impacts that they're having on Australia's heritage. Oh, this one stopped working for me. I don't know if somebody else can move me along on the slide there. Just bear with us. But basically, you've survived the data part of the talk. So well done if you've made it this far. And in a second, we'll just move us on to the next stage of my talk, which will be about the kind of technology we can use when, when we're actively doing our work, how we record our archaeology, and how we can then share it on as well. So in a second, once we've got it up, I'm going to have a slide with a QR code there. And once that comes up, if you have got a phone or a tablet handy, if you just hit that QR code, it'll bring up a 3D model of a scan that we actually performed on one of the artifacts that they discovered during the Cross River Rail archaeological excavations. You'll see it there. That's our QR code. So if you want to hit that, have a bit of a look. This image that you see in the center of the screen, that's not actually a photograph. That's actually a render from a 3D scan that we performed of that artifact. So once you've got it up, you can manipulate this model around. And if you've got an AR-compatible device, you can actually hit the button down the bottom right of your screen, and that will pull up an augmented reality version of that artifact, which you can then place on the desk next to you and have a bit of a look around. And now, if you've had time to have a look at that, hopefully you can start to get a feel for the kind of possibilities that this kind of technology can really offer, technology and any discipline. So if we can, there we go. So this model, this toothpaste box, we scanned through a technique called photogrammetry, which as opposed to something like laser scanning, this actually produces a 3D model from a whole suite of photographs. And so how you do this is you get your object and then a camera, really any camera, even your phone, and you want to take between 60 and 100 photographs, often trying to get as many angles around that object as possible, ideally as close to a full sphere of perspectives around that object. And then you run it through specialized software. Although I say that, now there's apps and freely available open source software that you can look up to do this yourself at home. But in terms of the research spec, you run it through specialized software, which will then compare pairs of these photographs for similar clusters of pixels, which it'll then jot a point onto. It'll then come back, look at all the photos and locate those consistent pixels and calculate the relationship between those points, which it can then array in 3D space, which is what's called a point cloud. And so that'll be the guts, that'll be the skeleton of your model. It'll then reprocess that point cloud to join up all the dots and turn it into a 3D mesh made out of polygons, and that'll give you the shape of your model. And then lastly, it'll come back to all your photographs and attempt to wrap them around that model, which will give you your color, it'll give you your detail, and that's how you get your completed model. And there's a few different techniques of how you can do this. Photogrammetry I've just spoken about. Laser scanning, I'm sure you're more than familiar with. But one that you might not have heard about is called a structured light scanner, which is an interesting approach. There's a device pointed at a rotating object, and the device projects different patterns across the object and then measures the distortion of those patterns across the shape of the object. And then as it goes around, it can get all angles and then use those distortions over the shape of the object to reconstruct that object as a 3D model. And now, especially in the case of photogrammetry and laser scanning, you can mount these kind of things on a drone. You can even have them handheld. So, of course, you can take as many photos as you like with your iPad and your phone, but you might have also seen that some of the latest tablets are actually coming out LiDAR ready straight out of the box, which will let you just, walk around an object and scan it live, which is quite exciting. And on that, the last kind of delivery mechanism, which is very exciting, are these walk-through technologies, especially, the sort of the devices at the cutting edge, which are often, a bit bulky at the moment, sort of a device handheld connected to a backpack, which is where all the processing power is. But what it allows you to do is it uses a combination of a few of these approaches to scan and produce a model live as you're walking around waving it about. So, you know, for things like heritage listed buildings, this can actually allow you to just walk around room by room and then go out, get the exterior, and have a full scan of a full building within a couple of hours. And then you can then send this back to your heritage architect back in the office, and they're happy. They don't have to go anywhere, and they can measure up everything to their heart's content. So that's an area I feel like where this technology is going to, you know, cause huge waves, because once, you know, you can just wave something around and get a full three-dimensional scan of whatever you're looking at, that kind of speed and efficiency will mean that we can just apply it anywhere and everywhere. We can do it with what we're finding out on surveys. We can do it in our excavations. And so there's early, you know, test projects for this kind of thing. It's a bit time-consuming at the moment, but you can still produce really, really nice results. So in the top left there, we've got a 3D scan by photogrammetry of an archaeological feature of a room with stone floors, stone walls. You know, you can now look at that in really nice detail and get an impression of that feature that it would be really hard to replicate from photos and sketches. But an interesting area that hasn't really been explored fully just yet is an example of the top right there, where that's, you know, as archaeologists are working in an excavation, they're coming down layer by layer, and as they get towards the end of a layer, they will, you know, start recording everything, they'll sketch everything, they'll photograph everything, clean it up, but then now they're starting to get a 3D scan by photogrammetry of, you know, an excavation in progress of a particular occupational layer. And, you know, while that doesn't seem like much, you know, that might just seem like sort of an incremental sort of increase in detail. You know, we've now got this vivid representation of, you know, a bit of dirt that we're digging. But if you imagine some of these, you know, massive sites in places like the Middle East, where, you know, you've got these huge occupation mounds which have been built up over thousands of years, and the projects that they're digging them, you know, up in the northwest corner, they've got this huge trench that's been going for decades, and they're all the way down to the Bronze Age, right? But then when you pull back over to the southeast corner, they're still working way up here on the Byzantine. And so, you know, you're recording everything as you're going, and you're finding interesting things, but it's quite abstract to try and get impression of, you know, what the Bronze Age site looks like, because so much of it is still buried and so much of it is still the Byzantine over here. But once we've got to the point, and there's a few projects that are trying this, once we've got to the point where, you know, we've been working for decades and we've got 3D scans of all this work that's been done across the site, we've now dug the entire site down through the Byzantine, and we can now reconstruct by, if all these scans are georeferenced, we can link them up one to the other and produce a complete 3D representation of the entire Byzantine settlement, which is a perspective that you just can't get otherwise, which is pretty huge, just to give you a completely different sense of space and a completely different idea of what life is going to be like, being able to look at, you know, the streets and buildings of a particular time across a whole settlement. And another application for this kind of technology that I find really exciting is exemplified by these bottom two images there. So on the bottom left, what we have is a photograph of the Arch of Palmyra in Syria. And then on the bottom right, we have 3D representation that from a 3D scan. So, you know, it's highly detailed, very cool, but what makes this so interesting and so unique is that, tragically, that arch was destroyed by ISIS well before anybody ever got it into their head to 3D scan it. But here we go, we've got a 3D scan. How did it happen? Well, this project is an example of what's called crowdsourced photogrammetry. So what this project did is, after the arch was destroyed, they put the call out all around the world to get everyone to send in their travel pics, their selfies with a little bit of the arch there in the background. And they've pulled all those together along with any other sort of photography they could find of the site. They cleaned them up, prepared them, and then ran them through this photogrammetry software. And voila, we've got a 3D representation of a place that just doesn't exist anymore. That site right now is rubble, but we now have a 3D record of that site that anybody can access, onwards for all time. And I think, that's huge. And if you can then, knowing that, if we push this forward into sort of, technologies that are really still emerging, there's sort of some early prototypes, these sort of things being used in archaeological projects, but, the envelope just hasn't been opened in so much of this stuff. If you can imagine, chucking on a virtual reality headset and then being able to walk through, being able to walk under the arch of Palmyra, right? And, any of the most amazing sites all over the world right there. And, to the point where once, the handsets and all that have gotten better, being able to interact with that site. And then on the flip side, in the augmented reality sphere, imagine, once we're able to travel again, imagine going to Syria, going to that site in Palmyra, chucking on your glasses, and then watching the rubble rebuild itself there before your eyes and being able to walk around the arch there at that location in that space. That's huge. And all it's going to do is going to mean that, archaeologists are going to be able to tell stories that are that much more engaging, that are that much more vivid, and to just be able to bring the kind of discoveries and the things that we're learning every day to more people all the time. And so why I've left it for last is because I think that's where a lot of the big change is going to happen, and a lot of the big change that you, the public, are going to be able to engage with and interact with. And so just a couple of early kind of examples. These are polished products, I would say, but I still feel like they're really just prototypes of something that can be pushed so much further. So, all the most amazing museums of the world are doing these virtual museums. You can virtually walk through and get a 360-degree representation, and a lot of them are 3D scanning their entire collections so that, you can go to the virtual museum, walk around, see something that you're interested in, click on it, and then get a 3D representation. But then on the flip side, there are, some of the world's most amazing sites are actually coming to you, like this project down the bottom of the screen there, which is actually, they've 3D scanned to very, very fine resolution detail the entire tomb of King Tutankhamun, and they've then 3D printed and otherwise constructed like a flat-packed tomb, which they then ship all around the world and set up so that you can go and walk through a super, super accurate representation of King Tut's tomb without having to go there. And they're having a lot of trouble at the moment with just simple things like the humidity that visitors are bringing into physically going to King Tut's tomb is actually slowly degrading the tomb. So it's going to close one of these days and people aren't going to be able to get in there. But this is going to mean that you can still get that full experience, and importantly, people are going to be able to get that experience, school kids, anyone who can't pay the thousands of dollars to be able to get over to Egypt. And that's, democratizing archaeology for everyone, which is also, a huge, technology has a huge part to play in that. Yeah, but to be honest, where technology and archaeology goes next is very much a page yet to be written. I'm very excited to see what kind of innovations come out, where they push it, and I hope from this little sample of what's going on that you've got a little bit excited as well. So thank you all very much for coming, and that concludes the live stream series this year. for Cross River Rail's National Archaeology Week. I hope you've enjoyed it. And yeah, that's all from me. Have a great morning.